Good evening, and welcome once again to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm your host, Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical, and my guest tonight is my very good friend and frequent returning friend of the show now, Renee Johnston. Catch everybody up? How have things been going with you?
Things are okay. School year got started and just trying to get through without going crazy. And I started really doing some work with the Mind Your Vowels, trying to see if we can get that rolling. And it's a crazy time though.
It really
some
is
nutty stuff happening.
and it's a crazy time even when you don't factor in that today was election day.
Exactly.
My favorite election day text message story is from a friend of mine in Michigan who watches the show. And because she watches the show, you can guess her politics right there. So she got a text message from Blake Masters all the way down in Arizona asking her to show up and vote for him. Up in Michigan, this is happening.
That's good.
And the Republicans are worried about Democrats throwing kind of a wide loop when it comes to elections. But Blake Masters is asking people in Michigan to come vote for him in Arizona. That doesn't seem right.
No. And I've been getting emails for the past 2-3 weeks to somebody named David. How on earth my email address got attached to a Democrat named David is still beyond my comprehension. But no lie, like 10 to 12 emails a day from the Democrats asking for $7. And I don't really understand what's happening. It is so truly bizarre.
No,
I have no idea what's happening.
All the emails I'm getting are what I would expect to get under my own name. So I can't claim anything else other than that. But I will say that I get lots and lots and lots of text messages. I have no idea why. If I were friends,
I did not get a lot of text messages.
If I were good enough friends with Joe Biden that I thought he would really read my replies, I would tell him to stop texting me. I'm not going to vote for him or give him any money.
That's how I feel about it too. Just no.
And it's
the answer is no.
And if Joe Biden is going to be texting me, I should not be getting texts from him that read, "Hey, Chris, this is Joe. I'm sorry, Mr. Biden. We're not on first name terms. Please call me Mr. Richard."
Well, at least they have your name right. So I guess there's that. I would love to know who David is and why David gave them my email address. I would love to know.
Well, let me think. The one David I can think of off the top of my head was a sort of annoying liberal dude on Twitter, but I don't know how he would have gotten your email address to give to anyone.
So bizarre.
There's so many weird things out there, I have to admit.
Yes. And it's getting weirder. And it is almost, I watch as like different things are happening. And obviously, like, major media has no interest in giving people real information about anything, right? It's all like filtered through the lens of what corporations really want us to know and what the government really wants us to know. And so you have to go on this constant like search to find real information, right? Like, because if you just went off of what MSNBC told you, you'd be completely in the dark about like legitimately what's happening here and around the world. Like, it's the bizarrest thing.
If I went off of what MSNBC was saying, then I might at one point have believed smash and grab robberies were the biggest problem in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, that wasn't all of MSNBC. That was just Joe Scarborough shilling for Eric Adams in the morning. But still.
Right. And then now they have the nerve to be like, oh, the Republicans are like using this to their advantage. Duh. Like,
I mean, so I'm sorry. I'm sorry. When the Democrats started going on and on and on about crime, did they really think the Republicans would not end up benefiting?
Your guess is as good as mine. I have no idea. If they thought that, I don't know why.
So it makes me wonder if the Democrats are in on this or not, because now obviously we know they are, but still, I'm going to step outside and pretend maybe they're not for a moment. So we have this thing in the media where ex-Republican politician gets up on TV and says, crime, 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 crime.
Mm-hmm.
And what the white people with a certain amount of money hear when watching him on TV is black, poor, black, poor, black, poor.
Right. Right.
And so this is coding from Republicans to white voters. When they say crime, they mean we're going to tell cops to be mean to black people so you can be less scared.
Right.
Because they'll be too scared of cops to come to your neighborhood.
Right.
Which is kind of a weird message in today's day and age, where more than anything else, who your neighbors are is determined by income.
Right.
And as a result, you can't guarantee that you'll never see black people in your neighborhood, because despite all attempts at stopping it, there are rich black people and professional black people too now. Right. Fewer than white people, but still exist.
Exactly.
And let's be fair, it should be pointed out that while bad things have happened to black celebrities and black intellectuals and black rich people at the hands of cops, they don't usually get shot the way the poor black people do.
No, they do not. Not usually, no.
The beer summit would not have been possible if Henry Louis Gates was a fifth grade teacher in Boston and not a Harvard, not a college professor in Cambridge.
Right.
I think sometimes it's important when mocking President Obama's failure to do things right, it's important to understand the real missing the mark of the beer summit, in the fact that if it hadn't been a reasonably well-off black guy in a area with reasonably responsible cops by comparison, he'd be dead.
Right.
And nobody ever dwells on that. There was a thing in Milwaukee where one of the Bucks got beat up by cops. And no one really dwelt on the fact that if he hadn't been an NBA star, he probably would have gotten shot and not just beat up.
Right.
And I think it is important to keep that in mind sometimes, because it seems like celebrities, whether they want to say it to me or whether they want to say it to you, it seems like celebrities really want us to think they have the same kind of skin in these games that we do.
I think it depends on the celebrity.
That's true. That's definitely true.
Right? Like, some people think the riches have found them some path away from melanin, which, eventually they always find out that that's just not correct, right? Like, there's no amount of money you can have that erases your melanin.
Well, but so this brings to mind the LA mayor's race, though, which is foremost in my mind because of the Young Turks crowd, especially Cenk and Anna, seeming to support Rick Caruso, who's like the Donald Trump of Los Angeles, big real estate mogul with lots of questionable money from questionable sources.
Right. But I mean, Cenk's been on a real,
well, but
more cops.
But the thing to remember is that the other candidate for mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, has not been running on some sort of soft and crime defund the police platform. Karen Bass has been running very vocally, and I'm going to give the cops more money.
Oh, so neither one of them are useful.
Well, Karen Bass should be more useful, and in theory was running because she wanted to be useful. She wanted another black mayor of LA. She wanted to make things better in Los Angeles. But she's talking about giving the cops more money, which feeds right into the I'm going to be tough on crime rhetoric of her opponent. And I'm sorry, she's a black woman running against a white man. And when they both talk about crime, the white voters in Los Angeles and in the more affluent parts of town are hearing black, 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 and remembering that Karen Bass is a black woman. Why do Democrats feed into this rhetoric? By talking about crime.
I don't. Your guess is as good as mine. I think so. I think part of the issue is that people honestly believe that they cannot win if they don't do that, right? Like they get into this mindset that like in order to win, they have to support the cops. They have to support being tough on crime. They have to, so they start going down that path because they're looking for donors. They're looking for support. They're looking for the media to not, make mincemeat out of them, right? Like they're not talking to like regular people who don't think that this is a good idea, right? And not that all regular people are of my mindset, which is there are way too many cops and the last thing you need to do is fund anything else or bring any more in, like enough, right? There's too many.
Well, much credit. The one abolitionist on the New York City Council is in Harlem. So not everybody in New York is who's poor is not thinking about their own interest.
Right. But it's a tricky dynamic because people are trying to sell themselves, right? Like it's not really about talking to your constituents and having real conversations and making statements based on what the people who are actually going to vote for you are looking for you to do, right? It's about how many donors can you get? How many people can you get to say they endorse you? How many,
And let's not forget, to be fair and to give those constituencies credit, New York and Los Angeles are where all the Democratic Party's donors live. Right. So it's kind of silly not to expect candidates for mayors of those cities, even Democrats, not to really crawl across the razor blades on their belly for their donors.
Right. Right. And, not for nothing, I'm not giving them any money. So, I'm not high on the list of who they're talking to about, what they're putting on their platform. But, I'm going to venture to say that if they really went into communities and had conversations with people, they would discover that people are not real big fans of police. Like, people don't want crime, but police don't stop crime. So
and most people who have experience with crime understand that police don't stop crime.
Exactly.
The trouble is all the people who are scared of crime are usually people who don't have experience with it.
Exactly. It's all people who want to protect their property, right? It's not, and probably not, all is probably not the best word to use. It's extreme, but the majority of people who have these conversations about we have to bring more cops, we have to do more, it's because they're worried about something that they own or something that they have possession of being taken from their
or they're scared for personal safety and believe propaganda.
Right.
It's very fair to say that there is a lot of specific propaganda.
Yes.
Really targeting what I would call the black and the queer and the woman's demographic in order to try to make people see cops as their only protection from the scary people out there which is kind of odd because those groups are groups that have reasons to be scared of cops.
Exactly. And, one thing, and it's a conversation that I've had multiple times with people, is they talk about like how bad it is now in New York. It's so bad. And then they bring up New York in the 80s and 90s, right? And they say it's almost, it's not like this this story that keeps getting sold that like it's so bad, it's as bad as it was back then, is just total nonsense. So I lived in Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s. I grew up in Brooklyn. Like, it was bad. Like, it was bad. And even as someone who grew up in that area, I wouldn't have wanted more cops.
When I was a kid, growing up in the suburbs of Los Angeles, watching all the LA local news, that was the time when LA was considered the gang capital and the murder capital of the country. And it may or may not have been true, but it was very deeply believed, especially by cops in Los Angeles whose money depended on it.
Right.
And I know for a fact that crime in Los Angeles now is nothing like crime was in Los Angeles when I was a kid.
Right.
They're having to find reasons to arrest enough people to rent them all out to the corporations that pay California for prisoners.
Right.
When Kamala Harris was saying the state needs their labor back in the day, she was saying we're getting short of prisoners. We can't let the pot smokers go.
Which is so gross. Like, it's just so gross.
It is.
It's gross. I just can't.
Well, a lot of people still don't make the connection between Kamala Harris and what's happening in San Francisco now.
Right.
They miss that part.
Right.
I was somebody who was really, really active in tweeting about how dishonest and horrible the Chesa Boudin recall was really shocked when I said, does this mean, I said to him after everything was over, does this mean Brooke Jenkins is going to be vice president someday? And he's like, what are you talking about? And I explained, well, Brooke Jenkins is Kamala Harris 2.0. This is a replay of what happened when Kamala Harris ran against Terrence Hallinan for the gentrifiers back in the 90s and early 2000s. And you mean, yeah, all that cop stuff we were telling you in the primaries about Kamala Harris, that was true.
Right. I mean, I'll never forget, and I wish I could remember where I got it from, but there was a video that someone put together of her calling herself the top cop. And yes. It was like one after, I'm the top cop. I'm the top cop.
Well,
I will never forget thinking to myself, this is who they picked to like run on the ticket.
What's more,
president. Like, this was the big great idea that they came up with.
They picked her to be president originally because they were sure she would really channel that Obama groove and get all the people who had supported Obama out there to support her. It was really, really, really strongly believed as an article of faith. You remember that huge rally MSNBC had for Kamala Harris, that they went to all that effort to make look like such a big deal for her campaign launch?
No, but I don't watch MSNBC.
It was huge. It was huge. I mean, they went to a lot of effort, MSNBC did, to make Kamala Harris look like a real candidate. And then she didn't get any delegates in her own state.
Right. Zero, not one. And, one of the things, so my family is all from Jamaica, right?
Yep.
It's a whole, like, us still trying to figure out, like, going back generations. But both my parents are Jamaican. And so I will never forget when her father was basically like, I don't want any part of whatever she's doing. And I remember thinking,
well, no, I remember he's like,
I remember thinking, how
she's
bad do you have to be for your
well,
father to be
he
like
was
in
he
public?
was he was specifically talking about that interview where she went on about how much pot she smoked, and he's like, and he's say, and she said this was because she was Jamaican. What is she trying to present? A whole bunch of stereotypes about how we just lay around and smoke pot all the time?
Right.
Is my daughter racist or something? I don't think he actually said that last part, but
no, but he was not happy, and
no, he wasn't.
He was not giving her like, you know, a glowing recommendation for president or for anything. And you know, for me, that told me a lot her, right? Like,
yes,
Jamaicans, that's a proud group of people. So if you encounter a Jamaican who can't get support from Jamaicans, that's a pretty bad sign.
Well, it is seemed, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm over dramatizing the childhood of a politician. But it seems like there was some cultural conflict in that house, and that maybe Kamala was more on her mom's side than her dad from time to time, and that perhaps that has reflected in feelings ever since.
Right. Yeah.
That would also explain some of her positions that could be interpreted by harsh critics as anti-Black, like running against crime when we all know it's coded language in San Francisco, where all the Republicans are white Democrats.
Right. Right. Or, you know, fighting to keep people in prison when they don't have to be there.
Yes.
Or threatening to put parents in jail because their kids don't go to school.
The truancy thing is a huge race and class issue, actually. Absolutely. In California.
Absolutely. Because if you're not a stay-at-home parent, how can you keep track of if your child goes to school? And listen,
exactly.
This is not to say like truancy isn't a big deal, right? Like, I work in a high school. I'm well aware of like how important it is to, you know, go to school if you're required to be in school, and that the parents have to bear some responsibility for that. But there is also a level of understanding that comes from recognizing that in many communities, if you have to get up and go to work, and if you have 2 or 3 jobs, and the only thing that you can do in the morning is wake your kid up and say, hey, I'm going to work, but get up, you got to go to school. There's not much else. It's a hard thing to control, especially once your kid gets to high school.
And let's face it, the reason that shows as flawed as they were, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Veronica Mars, really caught on with people is because high school really does kind of suck. And kind of does feel in some ways like a horror story or a film noir.
Right. It is not a fun place. And if you don't have the right clothes, if you don't always have food, if you don't have somebody at home to help you with stuff, if you don't have support to get your homework done, if you don't have an internet connection, if you don't have a computer, if you don't, like, there's so many things that play into being able to get through that day-to-day experience of being in school, right? And so it's not an easy experience, not for the student, not for the parent, not for the there's all kinds of things that play into that. And I really thought it was a disservice to families to just basically say like, okay, well, if you don't make sure your kid gets to school, we're going to start throwing you in jail, versus maybe putting in some resources to make a decision, to make like some kind of assistance to families when they're not coming to school, to find out like, why isn't this child coming to school every day? Maybe it's because, the parents working 3 jobs and there's still no food in the house, and the kid doesn't have clean clothes and they're struggling. Or maybe it's because they live in a rough neighborhood and they're afraid to go to school in the morning. Like, there's so many things that could be playing into that. For the answer to be, we're just going to throw people in jail. Like
Yeah.
that to me was just a real, oof.
And I will just say, since this comment was made while I was talking about how bad high school can be, it never ends. I swear, I still feel like I'm in high school sometimes. And let us say that is by design. There has been a change in the way we teach our children in America. In the days that our great grandparents used to talk about when our grandparents were young, there was the town school where there might have been one teacher and kids spent maybe a couple of hours a day at school, certainly not all day the way they do now. Kids had chores to do at home, and they couldn't be spending all their day at school when their work was needed at home.
Right.
And yet, kids were better educated. While literacy in general was low, the ones who did finish school and were literate were reading Moby Dick in 5th grade.
Right.
I mean, and I'm not even just talking about difficulty of language, though obviously the dialect is a little bit different between then and now. But can you imagine anybody assigning something like Moby Dick in 5th grade now? Not because I don't think kids could handle it. I'm absolutely sure they could, but simply because nobody would consider 4th or 5th graders ready for something like that.
Right. Right. And we're doing a real disservice to kids by almost not allowing them the resources and the opportunity to grow from those things, right?
Yes.
Like you and I went back and forth a while back about giving kids opportunity to make decisions, right? Like,
yes.
If you don't instill in your child like the ability to weigh options and to choose something, right?
Yeah.
And to be able to resolve in their head like if something's a good idea versus if it's a bad idea, if this is best for them and not good for them. Like, who are you sending out into the world in however many years?
And that's a good question too, because we infantilize adults. And the reason that we infantilize adults is because we've infantilized children.
Right.
When I was in 4th grade, I was walking home from school by myself.
Me too.
Yeah. And now I hear people talk about the idea that kids somehow being alone after class is the most horrible thing ever. It's like, do they not remember latchkey kids?
Right. Right. But our generation, I don't know if it's because our parents, I can't figure out why things are so different, right? I don't know if it's because there wasn't access to the information. I start thinking to myself, there's no way that like the stuff that's happening now wasn't happening when I was a kid. But there was no internet, there was no social media. Like it was a sparse amount of information that was getting to everybody, and now everybody gets everything.
Now the problem now is info glut.
Right.
There is so much information out there that you have to you now have to work to decide what's good.
Right.
Whereas there was so little information once upon a time that you actually had a fairly good chance of getting good information by going to by looking at a few media sources, simply because the people who needed good information were watching the same news as the people who didn't need good information.
Right.
And so you had to put good information in the news everybody watched.
Right.
Nowadays, you have 12 different levels of news.
And almost all of them suck.
Almost all of them suck. Almost all of them are right-wing to one degree or another.
Right.
You've got your local news, which might be owned by Sinclair. If it's not owned by Sinclair, then it's still probably owned by your local garbage can king or tire king or whoever the local rich guy is, whatever he's famous for.
Right.
How
do you get away? Like, how do you get away from that? Right. Like, I think of the amount of times I circle back because, normally this time of night, I'm like trying to get myself shut down. So I usually watch your show on like playback on YouTube a couple of days later. And I always think to myself, like, there's so much information that people can get from you and your audience is not big, right? And then you look at these boo-boos on, TYT, and they're like, so what? We're bringing Matt Gaetz on. We're trying to, we're going to hold him to the fire, which is all horseshit. Like, they're not doing that.
If he thought he was going to be held to the fire, why would he go on?
Right. And, then you have these major news sources that don't provide news, right? Like, they don't provide any information. They don't tell you the truth about what's happening. And everybody's like sucked into the vortex of like misinformation or no information. And if you're okay, right, if you have a job and a car and a house and insurance and all those things, like, you're like, oh, okay, well, life isn't so bad. And I always wonder, like, do people understand how quickly, like how much in a blink your whole life can just completely change? And if you're not worried about the worst of us, right, and your life changes and you become part of the worst of us, the worst off of us, like, how did you not know that this was, like, how many people don't know that it's a possibility for your whole life to just be completely thrown out of sync because there's no information and because they're not looking for information? Well, like,
I think that there is a disconnect between the life that the average person experiences and their assumptions about reality and what reality really is. And I don't even mean just well-off or comfortable people. People who are struggling might not know what reality is because they're too busy struggling to take a good look.
Right.
It's hard when you're struggling.
It's very hard. I mean, when my son was little, we really just struggled for a while. And I can remember not paying as much attention to a lot of things as I would have then. Like, I pay more attention now, but I mean, I still didn't vote Obama the second time. Like, I paid enough attention to know that he dropped more bombs than he should have been dropping. I paid enough attention to figure out that, like, he was criminalizing journalists and that type of thing. Like, I paid enough attention to know that he let a whole bunch of people go bankrupt. Like, I feel like some of those big things that, like, should have been caught, right? Like, somebody should have noticed. Like, people don't, I don't want to, I hate to say people don't care because that sounds so callous, right? It sounds like, but people are really selfish. Like, people are really okay with, like, I'm all right. Like, I'm not worried. I'm good. I don't have to. And I wasn't raised to be that person. Like, I don't have it in me to just.
So people are, I'm not going to say selfish because I'm surprised sometimes by how generous people can be when they're actually motivated to it.
Okay. That's fair.
At the same time, people are tremendously self-centered.
Yes.
And the reason for that self-centeredness is whether it's because you're comfortable and so you don't have a much awareness of anyone else's reality because you're comfortable, or whether because you're struggling and therefore you have to be in that self-centered mindset to get through it.
Right.
Then it makes perfect sense. Also, we are an individualist society that teaches people that you are a special and unique individual who has an importance to the world. Now, I'm not trying to say that people aren't important or that people aren't special or that they aren't unique. But the problem is that everybody is special and unique, but our individualist society does not allow everyone to be equally special and unique.
Right.
And in the name of making special more special and unique more unique, we flatten out 80% of society and take this 20% ideal and say, this is reality.
Right. Right.
And we're missing a lot. We're missing a lot of good and bad. That 20% isn't even like just the rich people's experience. There's, far fewer than 20% of America is rich.
Right.
That 20% is what people are able to experience through the various lenses put on them as they go through life.
Right.
If you're white, there are racial lenses on everything. The whole media is built around making you think that your experience is normal and that other people's experiences might be worth a special episode or two, but the show's really about you.
Right.
And that's a problem. I will also admit that, and I hate to sound like a cranky grandparent now. There was an idealistic racial wholesomeness about television when I was a kid that is gone now. I mean, you can say a lot of things about, say, Different Strokes or Webster or a couple of other shows, that they went way too easy on capitalism and they went way too easy on rich people, and they gave us an unreasonable expectation of the kind of people rich people were. But one thing you have to say about Different Strokes is it was genuinely good on race at a time when that was really important.
Right.
And you had this whole generation that was sort of wanting that to be real.
Right.
And these were the people who were totally shocked in 2016. And these were the people who just could not believe what was happening and had a hard time understanding the circumstances under which Trump had won and the racial anger that was really waking up in a lot of these white Americans. And I look at all this and I think to myself, nobody could have made America ready to be racist again the way that Obama did. And it was because he worked so hard to make white people feel okay about being a little bit racist. From his running mate, Joe Biden, to the beer summit, trying to make the racist cop and the black Harvard professor get along. I mean,
I hadn't even thought of it that way. But
there's a forgiveness for white people in the way Obama addresses race.
That is a really good way to put it. And he's still now allows an ambivalence about race that he shouldn't allow. But it's, I think sometimes that's inherent in Black people who have achieved some sense of like, power, so to
Well,
speak, or money,
let's not forget, you talk about when people's personalities are formed. Who really raised Obama? His grandparents. Who were his grandparents? A couple of well-off white folks with some problematic attitudes about race that he was willing to forgive them about because they loved him.
Right.
And so from that relationship, you get a very ambivalent and forgiving attitude about certain forms of seemingly harmless white racism.
Right.
But when it comes to something like the Beer Summit or Ferguson or many other things, Standing Rock, many deeply important racial issues, Obama was just like any other president when it came down to it. The same way that Black mayors all over the country are just like any other mayor when push comes to shove.
Yep.
Or Black police chiefs.
Yep. It is, as a Black person, it is deeply, deeply depressing to me how easily and how willingly Black people who get a little bit of power sell their people out. Like, I watch it happening sometimes and I'm like, how did you forget? Like, how did we get to a place where you found yourself in a position where you could actually improve the situation of people that are a reflection of you, and you choose not to do it?
I'm going to take a slightly outside the box look at something that most people would consider a good thing. The integration of Major League Baseball.
Which killed the Negro League.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. At the time that Major League Baseball was integrated, the owner of the Newark, well, not the owner, the wife of the owner, but the general manager and president and sometimes field manager of the team, Effa Manley, the wife of the owner of the Newark Eagles, which had won the championship the year before in the Negro Leagues, was saying that because Jackie Robinson was probably going to become a star, that they were all going to be out of business in a few years, and that there was nothing that could be done to stop Black stars from selling out to white people and destroying Black baseball.
Right.
And there's
exactly what happened.
Exactly what happened. And there are fewer Black Americans playing now than there were Black Americans playing in just the 1960s or 1970s.
Yep.
And you can say there's all sorts of reasons for that, like basketball and football being much bigger and all sorts of other things if you want. That does not change the fact that there's more than enough talent, more than enough of a talent pool there that things wouldn't be different if owners and coaches in Major League Baseball didn't want things to be different.
Right. It gets to be such a tricky dynamic because I think as a people in general, right? Like, Black people have come to believe that in order for them to get the best of something, it means that they have to be included in, part of, accepted by white people, right? And so what you end up with is a lot of people who invest their time and energy into trying to become a part of that thing that white people have, right? So Black people start worrying about trying to get into Ivy Leagues, and now HBCUs don't become as important. They're worried about getting into certain job markets, and now, small businesses and, community businesses stop being as important. And it's hard to say like you shouldn't, because obviously like, you know it, it's so hard to explain because I get it, right? Like, I didn't go to an HBCU. I didn't, there were choices that I made that were absolutely in line with that same type of thinking. But so I get it. But then at the same
So,
time,
so you have an Ivy League degree you've never told me about.
no, I do not. I did not take it that far.
Well, that's good. That's good.
I had funny enough, I had no interest in applying to Ivy Leagues. I didn't even apply to one. I didn't want to go to one. I did apply to HBCUs, but the reason I didn't go to an HBCU is because they couldn't give me any financial aid.
Yeah.
And so my family couldn't afford for me to go to one of the 3 HBCUs that I got into, because the money wasn't there. But I did get the money, from Boston University and from Syracuse University. And so I had to go where it was going to be affordable for my family for me to go. So, that plays a role too.
Definitely.
But it's such a hard position to be in, because if you want to raise your kids in an area where you don't have to worry about violence, and where you don't have to feel like, you're going to be fearful at night, and where you don't have bars on your doors, unfortunately, that means you probably need to live closer to white people, right? Like, that's not that there aren't Black communities and pockets of Black communities that exist that are like that, but those are the minority. Like, that's not a typical experience. And so again, what ends up happening are the people who could improve a community by staying within it leave the community because they want to go somewhere where they can feel better about where they live, better about the educational opportunities, that type of thing. And then again, like, you're leaving the place that probably needs you the most, but there are no resources there for you.
Exactly. And that was in the same way that Black baseball, well, desegregation destroyed segregated industries and segregated businesses.
Yes.
And instead of actually having integrated institutions, we had white institutions with Black people in them.
Right.
And let's really actually engage with that, because when we're talking about white institutions with Black people in them, that means all the adapting is required of the Black people in the white institutions.
Right.
White people don't have to adapt.
Desegregation that would have allowed the Negro League to remain a thing would have meant that all the leagues would have combined together to make one baseball league, right?
Real desegregation at that time. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have had integrated teams, and that integrated teams would not have been the natural endpoint of the process. But honestly, real integration at the time would have been merging the Black leagues into the major leagues in such a way that Black teams and white teams competed against each other in a way that established them as equal to each other.
Right.
And
but instead, what happened was, all of the most popular players were lured away from the Negro League because they didn't have the money to keep them, as the major league had to lure them away. And then eventually the Negro League just kind of faded into
there was a period during what you would call two-tier baseball, where the minor leagues were mostly segregated, but the major leagues were increasingly integrated. The Negro League teams that survived actively by acting like minor league teams, looking for the best possible talent they could find, and then selling those players to the majors. Right. Now, for a metaphor, when you talk about how the slave trade consisted of people being forced by white people to go look for other black people and then sell them to white people in order to maintain their own economic survival, you see how the cannibalism of the Negro Leagues has this sort of weird parallel to the African slave trade.
Right. And a lot of professional sports.
Well, hey, there was an NFL owner who got in trouble once when he talked about their taking over the plantation.
Right.
Yeah, this is the absolute attitude about many of these owners have.
Right.
They think of their players as their property, even when those players are white people.
Right.
And when you add racism into that, it doesn't get better.
Right.
I mean, but even white people were complaining about slavery in baseball in the 1920s. Walter Johnson, who was one of the great stars, wrote a piece called Baseball Slavery, where he talked about how the reserve clause meant you could not ask for a raise, you could not go to another team, you were stuck there forever. And you were in a situation where the only way your situation could possibly be bettered is if your team went out of business, and therefore you were able to go to another team. Right. So it's like, we want our team to lose almost. And he was exaggerating a little, but there's this attitude. He describes this capitalist tension between the manager and the worker, where they're at war with each other.
Right.
And this was when they were still all white athletes.
Right.
So the attitude about their not just black players, but at the time, a small handful of black players who were chosen because of a certain belief in certain racial myths about black athletic talent believed by white people.
Right.
Which was naturally that obviously the really good Negro Leaguers are going to be 10 times better than any white person, because it's that special talent. They're just naturals. And so you see that even racism even colored why people were desirable assets, because they believed these immensely racist ideas about the natural athleticism of black athletes.
Right.
Which is, no, people worked like hell because they didn't want to be sharecroppers or live in the slums anymore.
Right.
Exactly the same reason that immigrants became athletes in the first place when the major leagues were all white, because they wanted to get out of the bad neighborhoods.
Right.
And if there was a time, and if it's come to seem since that all the best athletes are black, I would argue that that's primarily because who has the most reason to want to get away from where they are?
True.
I mean, when you see this great white athlete come along, and you sort of look at them and you feel, yeah, they're really good at what they do, but they didn't escape from where they were necessarily because of what they did.
Right.
I feel like Greg Maddux would have been okay if he had never played baseball for a living.
Probably. Probably.
And I don't think, and people underestimate motivation immensely and racialize things that are universal sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's a danger in universalizing too much, because this is America, and the black experience is always going to be different because this is America and because of that racism.
Right, because it's uniquely atrocious with regard to racism.
Uniquely atrocious, because this is the place, this is still the place where they created a distinction that never existed before between slaves and overseers.
Right.
Just to keep all the poor people in their place.
Right.
And then that became culturized.
Right.
And people forget how deeply baked into the culture that then becomes. Overseers do not want to feel equal to the slaves.
Right.
And when you threaten overseers' feelings of superiority, they get angry. And this is why in many cases it is the lower middle class and the less educated element of the reasonably well off, and not the poorest people or the richest people who are the most hatefully racist.
Right.
Because it's this small group of people who the only thing that makes them feel special is their whiteness.
Right. Which we also talked about on Twitter today, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's something that people need to understand.
Right.
I think it's something that white people don't think about enough, is that there are people out there who literally the only thing that makes them feel special is their whiteness, or worse, the only thing that makes them feel special is that they're white men.
Right.
And that's really the reason we can never get away, that's on some level, from identity politics completely. Because to get rid of identity politics, the first thing that happens is white people have to give up the white identity as normal, and have to give up the idea that everybody else has to adapt to us.
Right.
But that's the problem.
People who complain the most about identity politics never seem to notice that their concern with being white is also identity politics. Like, they miss that completely, right?
They never
it's totally lost on them.
Or they're concerned with being straight in a time where queer bashing is becoming increasingly popular.
Right.
Even among groups that I would consider normally to be allies. It's disturbing. Early today, someone who I never would have expected it from was taking the same side as TERFs in an argument about trans kids. Mm-hmm. And I look at this and it's like, how can you be this stupid?
Right.
And then I remember it's a white vegan, and white vegans are just this close to being Nazis. It's there waiting to get out. Because veganism is again about a feeling of moral superiority for a lot of people.
Right. And honestly, if you think about the privilege that's entailed in being a vegan, right? Like, to have access to only vegan food, like, that is.
So let me actually, I'm going to challenge the very idea of veganism in a capitalist world. The theory, because it's being vegan is not just about being vegetarian and only eating vegetable-based foods.
Right.
Veganism is supposed to be about a cruelty-free lifestyle.
Right.
No cruelty to animals, no cruelty to people, no cruelty in anything, no cruelty in your clothes, no cruelty in your food, no cruelty, period. So, how the heck is that possible?
Right. Right. You're naked and living in a hut, which, listen, I'm not gonna condemn anybody who wants to do that. Like, go for it, right?
Hey, there is a whole show where people will not even, they won't even pay you. You're just going on to promote whatever you're going on to promote. There is a whole show where you can live in the wilderness naked for a season if you want.
That's right, which is so bizarre on its own. But yeah, I mean, the reality is, if you're really going to be a vegan, right, there's some requirements based on that should not not exist in this place as it is.
In the United States, the simple fact is that if you eat vegetables, they were grown by a farm worker who was probably scared of both being working to death in the heat and being deported if they lived through the season.
Right.
And people don't think about that.
Right.
People don't understand how many people in working on farms die every year.
Right. Because that is hard work. It is not the heat, the chemicals, the stress, right? The labor. Like, that is not, it's not an easy job. You know, I have a friend who was making the comment about like immigrants and jobs. And, you know, I looked at her and I was like, boo, you're not going to go work on nobody's farm. Like, stop. Like, stop. You're not doing that. You're not going to go work in nobody's outside, picking nothing, cutting nothing, chopping down nothing. Like, you're not doing that. So please, like, just stop, right? So this, you know, there's also this, like, this false sell about what all these things mean, right? Like, what you just said about being a vegan is so true, right? Like, you as a vegan, you're buying your food from somewhere, right? You're getting dressed in your clothes that were in all likelihood made by people who are either in prison or living overseas and are not making anything.
Sweatshop labor in many cases, right, when it comes to clothes.
Right. And so this idea that you live in this cruelty-free lifestyle is just absolute nonsense. And I hadn't even gone that far in my head, which I should have. I was more thinking about the amount of people who live in food deserts who don't even know what vegetables look like because they don't have a place to access vegetables, right? Like, how are you going to be vegan if you don't know what broccoli looks like? If you know, you know what I mean? If you've never, you know, like literal teenagers who've never had certain fruits because they don't have access to those things. Like, you know, it's nonsense, right? Like, it's such a sell on this ideal of something that most people, I would venture to say, don't even have access to attempt to be, right? Like, you know, one of the funniest jokes I remember Chris Rock used to say, like, vegetarians, like, don't eat red meat, don't eat red meat, don't eat green meat, right? Like,
now I've been greatly
to be a vegetarian. Like, who has the resources to be a vegetarian? You know,
I've been greatly disappointed by Chris Rock's politics since these days, but I got to admit he was right. You know, let's raise the price of bullets.
He was right about that. You are not lying.
If we just make it harder for people to get the bullets.
That's right. I mean, it's just there's just this. It is overwhelming at times how obscenely unequal it is, right? Like, how, you know, like Zaina's in the chat, hey Zay, and like thinking about the struggles that people have trying to get somewhere, right?
Yes.
Like, trying to get something to go. They're good, smart, like, people who really want to do something, And in order to get access to the things that you need to have access to in order to be that thing, right? It's almost impossible if you don't have the leg up that all these people have, right? If you grow up in a poor neighborhood and you don't have generational wealth, or you don't have parents who can loan you money, or you don't have family who already has access to something, like how do you get where you need to go in order to establish something to be able to do the thing that you want to do, right? Like it's so unfair. The system is so just desperately unfair, and like it's hard. It's a hard thing to really sit back and watch sometimes. Like it's hard for me to sit back and watch it sometimes because I know I got out, right? Like I escaped it in part because my mother was very, very like cautious with her money, and she was very diligent in how she did things, and she put herself through school, and she worked really hard to put me in a position to be able to do something better than what she was able to do when she was my age now,
and I don't like to undersell the obstacles that other people have faced, but think about that. Imagine being able to save something for your kids now.
Right.
I mean, that's you hear the heroic stories about the things our parents did for us, and then you think, and that's almost impossible now.
Right. I mean, when I was a kid, riding the train in New York City, the tokens were $1. Right? So you could round trip wherever you got to go back and forth $10 a week if you had to get to work and back every day. It's $2.75 now one way, right?
Yeah.
Like, how did that happen? That's like that's absurd, right? Like that happened so quickly.
You think about how much prices have gone up, and then you think, okay, well, how much have wages gone up?
And they haven't. There's no parallel to that part. It used to be $4 to go into New York from New Jersey. Now it's 18. Right? Like you think of all the little things that, gas, when I first started driving, gas was like 89 cents a gallon. I went, it's madness.
And it's another form of poor tax.
It is.
Because if you don't have a car, then you're dependent on public transportation, and now you're paying the price of being poor.
Exactly. And nothing is set up to be beneficial to people who have the least, right? Nope. If you have a bank account, the fees are paid by the people who have the smallest amount in their accounts, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you overdraft your account, like banks make more money off of overdraft fees than they make off of anything, right?
Yeah.
So you already don't have money, and you mistakenly miscalculate your account, and now not only is your account about to be negative because you didn't have, because you had $15 less in there than you calculated for, right? You are now going to be negative. And when you go to deposit your next check, your bank can hold your check because your account was negative previously. Yep. They can say, okay, we're going to hold this check until we can verify funds.
My bank was able to cancel my account and send me a check for no other reason than they decided they didn't want me to be their customer anymore.
Which is
cancel my credit cards. I don't know why. They just canceled my bank account, nothing else. But it's just the weirdest thing. So I had to find another bank and try to get a direct deposit set up at work, and then get the check from my old bank into the new bank. It's like, why should they be able to do this so arbitrarily?
Right. And they'd never do it. I mean, actually, let's not say never, because Chase kicked Kanye out the other day. But you know, they wouldn't normally do it to a rich person, right? Like, you have $10,000 in the bank and you're not paying any fees for your account. And in fact, you're making money off of your account, because every time you spend money, you get like your cash back, whatever bonus things that they put in place if you have a lot of money, right? You can't get credit if you don't have money to pay down your credit cards. You know, there's fees for, you know, you go to the wrong ATM and you're spending $5 to $10 more taking cash out of your own account. And if you're poor, you have to go with one of these large banks that don't always have ATMs in the places you're going to. Like, it's a never ending cycle of completely keeping people who already don't have money in conditions and situations in which they are never going to be able to have money.
And the best way to get credit is a secured credit card. But if you don't have money to put against a secured credit card, you can't get your credit back.
Right. And people with the worst credit get the highest interest rates. Mm-hmm. Like, it just, there is no scenario set up to allow people who are struggling economically to get out of that struggle.
And how old is the credit system that we're talking about?
It's absurd. And and that the whole system, when you think about things like,
it's younger than me.
The system is set up so that your credit score, in any other place in the world, if a credit score is from 0 to 850, anybody who thinks about numbers as like actually like how numbers go, right? If your scale is 0 to 850, 425 should put you at 50%, right? Like, 450 should put you, you know, towards the top half of that scale. And 450 is like the bottom of the scale. It's
even it's ridiculous. And this is a system that, for the record, since the question was not answered, is younger than myself and Renee. It came around when we were, what, 12, 13, something like
that. Yeah.
And so that's Joe Biden never had to worry about his credit rating.
No.
Ronald Reagan never had to worry about his credit rating.
Nope. But Joe Biden was quick to make sure that he made everybody else worry about their credit ratings.
But what's interesting is, when the credit rating came around, it had only been barely 10 or 15 years since really a uniform end to most now illegal forms of housing discrimination. And they had to find something new. And the credit system was the new redlining.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And by targeting poor people, they were then able to say, we're not doing a racism. Mm-hmm. Look at all these poor people. We're not just keeping black people out of the neighborhood. We're keeping all these poor people out of the neighborhood. That's not racist.
What a system. Good.
And that was allowed. This was seen by our system. By our system, this was a legitimate way to avoid accusations of racism. Just keep all the poor people out. Be classist.
Yeah.
And it's not hard to see where these things come along. This is also the same time that Democrats rediscovered crime.
Mm-hmm.
And started to lose elections to Republicans after a little while because Republicans were getting more advantages from this discussion, and have ever since.
Yep.
And you have to think, you almost have to wonder, on some level, the Democrats have to know.
Oh, they definitely know. Every hard sell on these things is intentionally done in ways to convince poor people and Black people that like it's for their benefit, right?
Yes.
One of the biggest, when I made my statement about how useless Biden's pardons were going to be, I'll never forget how many people were so mad at me for bringing up the crime bill because all the Black people were behind it, right? For which I was like, I wasn't, right? Like I wasn't behind it.
So, and shall we all remember, I hate to call him out, but he's the one going on MSNBC every day now. Can we all please remember what Al Sharpton thought of the crime bill and Joe Biden in the 1990s?
Mm-hmm.
How the mighty have fallen.
Right. Like it wasn't as unanimous as everybody wants to pretend it was. And it's even for the Black people who had some level of power or position or whatever, who were behind it, many of them were not living in the communities that were going to suffer the most because of it, right? Like you had a lot of like churches who the leadership was behind it, but it's not hard to find out that a lot of pastors, they don't live in the communities where they're taking the money from, right? Like that's not where they live.
And sometimes even when they do live in those communities, that doesn't change the fact that it's not the pastor's house that's getting the home invasion in that community usually.
Right. And even for whatever Congress people that were like, there were people who spoke out, but eventually they got shut down and they went along, which unfortunately is what happens. But the reality is, if you weren't living in a neighborhood that was already over policed, right, you had no reason to understand why more policing and more jailing was not going to change the situation. Those neighborhoods were already over policed and over criminalized, and
let's not forget that there's also always been an element of strategic under policing in those same over policed neighborhoods,
right?
Because let's be honest, the cops usually have some idea who the actual criminals in a given neighborhood are.
Right.
And as a result, they don't need to do random stop and frisks of every Black dude in the neighborhood. They know who the criminals are.
Right.
So why do they do it that way instead?
Right.
What's the incentive?
Right. And also, where is the effort to stopping that stuff from coming into the community to begin with? Because, let's be really clear. There are no cocoa fields in Harlem, right?
It's true.
Like, they're not in the Bronx. They're not, they're not manufacturing
Nobody,
in those
nobody grows opium, to the best of my knowledge, in Los Angeles or Chicago.
Right. So, those things get flooded into these areas. And, I ended up saying this, like, first the government flooded these areas and communities with guns and drugs and created a problem. And then they punished all the people who were doing their best to survive within a problem they didn't create.
Why did the crack epidemic start? The crack epidemic started because cocaine was ridiculously cheap.
Right.
Why was cocaine ridiculously cheap? Because the CIA had flooded the market to fund the Contras.
Right.
So and before that, they had flooded the market. They had driven the bottom out of the heroin market by flooding the U.S. with heroin from Southeast Asia in order to pay for their wars in Southeast Asia.
Right. And this is what they do. If you look at, and it's still if you look at Haiti now, right? They don't manufacture guns in Haiti. They don't manufacture bullets in Haiti. Is anybody wondering why there's so many guns being shot in Haiti?
They don't grow coca in Haiti.
Right.
They don't grow opium in Haiti.
No. So all these things are coming through those ports, and nobody's stopping to wonder, like, who's allowing these things to come through the ports that are creating the problems that now have to be survived?
Let's just ask the question outright. What, more than anything else, has kept Haiti in such a horrible position for all the years since independence? And the answer is a foreign debt enforced by the U.S. Navy.
Right.
Let us not forget that a few years before World War I, Woodrow Wilson just invaded and occupied Haiti for no particular reason.
Right. Haiti will never escape being the place where slave revolts started.
Well, more than that, the place where slave revolts ended very emphatically and successfully. That's the real problem. Because there was a secret. You're from Jamaica. Well, your family's from Jamaica. You know the history. There's a secret war in the hills all those years between runaway slaves and the white folks. And it was kept secret as much as possible from the poor white folks and the people who were still slaves. Mm-hmm. Why? Because knowing that there were black people with guns and knives you could run away and go join was bad for morale on plantations.
Right. Right.
It's also bad for morale among poor white people. There were unhappy white people who joined.
Right. And those fights are still happening in Jamaica with the bauxite, and the Moors still trying to hold on to their land. There's about to be some serious problems on that island because, that culture, that group, they are not trying to let them come into their lands and tell anybody what they're doing. Like, that's just not going to happen. So, these are things that all circles back to the same issue, which is US and it's the friends, and they decide where they want to go and steal resources and build military bases, and they don't really care as they're doing that who is harmed in that process. It's just the never ending cycle of imperialism and capitalism.
I will say that they do care very much who is harmed in the process, and sometimes harming those people is the point. I bring Haiti up again, where the U.S. under Woodrow Wilson, I will say the one good thing that I hope everyone learned from MSNBC while Donald Trump was president is what a horrible racist Woodrow Wilson was. They were very honest about that in a way that white Americans never have been before. And so I think it's good for the culture that white people now know Woodrow Wilson was a horrible racist. But what he did to Haiti has to be taken in the concept of this was a horrible racist who did this to the only country in the Americas that freed itself from slavery.
Right. Right. I don't know. Zaina asked in the chat, I guess people are celebrating the Republican wins.
This one, yes. How do you guys feel about all these people on the left celebrating Republicans winning like it's going to mean something?
I first of all, and I think I like to use quotes whenever we talk about the left, because so many of these people who are on the left aren't actually on the left, whatever you want to call. So there's a line, right? So I think there's some people who feel like maybe if things get really, really, really bad, that'll
celebrationism.
Right. That'll force something different to happen, right? And I guess my thought is like, I mean, Trump was pretty bad, right? Like he was
well,
bad.
But let's go ahead and Trump was bad enough that things were happening.
Right.
People were protesting ICE on a massive scale.
Right.
People were protesting cops on a massive scale.
Right.
They've already managed to erase the ICE protest in a way that people don't even talk about how much people were protesting ICE anymore.
Right. And they made, BLM marches riots, right? Yep. It didn't take them long to label every single march as violent and burning the city down and, all these things. And I think, I think a lot of people, I think what happens is people are enraged, they're enraged initially, and then they do the thing, right? They put on their pink hat and they go, they go out and they don't have brunch and, they do the thing. And then they quietly realize that, their life actually hasn't gotten that bad, right? Mm-hmm. Like they still have their job and they still have their car and they still have insurance and so they get lulled back into like, oh, well, actually this isn't.
Or in the case of many Democrats and liberals, Biden won, so they went home.
Right. Right. We're not, and it kills me because, kids still in cages. There's so many Trump policies that people complained about when he put them in place, and Biden kept them. And no one seems to care that Biden kept them.
And there are there are three different ways of looking at the whole Democrat-Republican thing. And each one of them has its own level of truth and value, and it's very hard sometimes for me to take sides. But position number one, the harm reduction position. Mm-hmm. I'm going to vote for Democrats because it's harm reduction. I may not vote for a Democrat in every race, but if I do vote, I'm going to vote for the Democrat, blah, blah, blah. Or maybe they even do say, vote for every Democrat. You have to. The Republicans are too bad not to, at least if you live in a battleground state.
Right.
So all this stuff. And I see the point of voting Democrat in some circumstances, if you really put it like that. But you're not going to change anything.
Right.
You're not going to make things better. And you're only voting in that situation to slow down how bad things get.
Yep.
Number two is what I consider the reasonable, rational position of an enlightened person, which is that yes, Republicans are overtly Nazis, and Republicans should not be allowed to win. And that may justify voting for Democrats sometimes. But that does not mean Democrats are good. That does not mean there is any virtue in voting for Democrats to vote for Democrats. And more importantly, if you really believe in the democratic accountability thing, there is a certain virtue in saying the Democrats have to lose consistently until they actually do better to ever be motivated to do better. That was the argument that Lawrence O'Donnell used to give to people who would listen to him when he talked about what he thought the left should do better, which was, maybe don't vote for someone if they won't actually commit to doing stuff for you. Or if they don't follow through on these commitments, don't vote for them again.
Right.
Not that he would ever admit to that now, but that video is still all over Twitter on occasion.
Right. It's so for me, like I had a friend who said to me today, like, I'm still gonna vote for Democrats because at least I think she said, like, at least they support women's rights or something. I'm partially quoting. And I love her because she really, over time, she's really mad at me for my stances. And over time, she's really like started to kind of hear what I'm saying and to realize like I'm not just being like the crazy like revolutionary, right? Like, and so my answer to that was, okay, so yes, that is true. Like on the surface, they support these things, and on the surface, they may appear to be better than Republicans. But every opportunity that they've had to shut Republicans down, they have not taken it. And so, therefore, where is the benefit in supporting a group of people who are willing to allow you to suffer?
And let's be honest, the simple fact is that the Democratic Party leadership are the worst people in the Democratic Party.
Right.
I don't care whether your position on the squad is extremely nuanced and complicated, whether you love them or whether you hate them. Regardless of your position on the squad has no power in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is run by Nancy Pelosi, who's a horrible human being.
Right.
The Democratic Party is run by Steny Hoyer, also a horrible human being.
Right.
Let us remember, and this is something too easily forgotten today, but Nancy Pelosi is only Speaker of the House because she could argue, at least I'm less horrible than Steny Hoyer.
Right.
And that Nancy Pelosi had deliberately tried to block Steny Hoyer with a more liberal Democrat named John Murtha for majority leader. And that Murtha was prevented from becoming majority leader because of a scandal that greatly benefited Republicans and Steny Hoyer. And then you see, and the Democratic Party since then has been just awful.
Yeah.
Before that, you have Joe Biden. Joe Biden is one of the worst people in the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
He is someone who was only on the ticket to keep the handful of people like John Kennedy of Louisiana, who were still Democrats in 2008. Yes, let's all remember John Kennedy of Louisiana, though I don't think he was in the Senate, was a Democrat in 2008. But to keep Democrats like John Kennedy happy. Barack Obama made Joe Biden his running mate. And John Kennedy is still a Republican today.
Right. There really is just a lack of, I don't even know what the word is. When I look back at when Obama won in 2008 and how they had the Senate and they had the House and they had the presidency, and yes, I know they only had the actual super majority for what was it, like 72 days or whatever it was. But if anybody thinks if the Republicans had the supermajority, they wouldn't have pushed through every single policy that they wanted to push through in those 72 days.
Everything they could have done in 72 days, they would have done.
Every single thing they could have done in 72 days. And so when you look at how unwilling Democrats are.
Remember how the Republicans immediately tried to repeal Obamacare after Donald Trump was president?
Mm-hmm.
How they went out of their way to do everything they could to get rid of Obamacare right away because they promised to?
Right. And, even things like, a justice dies and you can't replace them. It's too close to and you fools let them do it. You let them do it. And then when it was time for them to back down because we were 2 weeks away from it, all of a sudden, to me, it's bizarre that you have one party who allows another party to be completely out of control.
So let me ask you a really serious question.
Responsible.
Let me ask you a really serious question, because I asked an Obama defender this very question on Twitter once and didn't get an answer. So I'm gonna pose this question to you. Obama took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution when he became president, right?
Mm-hmm.
So shouldn't that mean that he should have protected and defended the Constitution from Mitch McConnell when Mitch McConnell decided not to hold a vote?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things, in my opinion, that Obama should have.
Now, let me say for the record that I'm against the Constitution for a lot of reasons. I'm not trying to apologize for the U.S. Constitution, but Obama took an oath.
Right.
He was president. President Obama took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. Why did he not protect and defend the Constitution from Mitch McConnell?
Right. The world may never know. That's going to be right up there with.
And second,
to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop.
Mitch McConnell and every other Republican senator. Mitch McConnell took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution when he became a senator.
Right.
He took an oath to follow the Constitution and be bound by it.
Right.
What happened to his oath? Who's enforcing it? Where is the perjury cop dragging Mitch McConnell in front of the "you betrayed your oath to the Constitution" court?
Right. And it's never going to happen.
Of course not.
No.
But
no one is ever going to hold the people who should be held responsible for the abysmal state of the majority of the population responsible for the things that they did that created this situation. It's not part of the plan.
But they don't respect their own rule book anymore. The people in charge are not respecting the rules of their own game with each other.
But I don't know, and I could be wrong, but I don't know of a time, a place in history where the rule books were ever really.
Well, so let me give you an example. Just after Woodrow Wilson, the next president was a man named Warren G. Harding.
Mm-hmm.
Warren G. Harding had several character flaws. One of his great character flaws was that he kind of did what he was told when it came to making cabinet appointments. He owed people favors. Those people had made him president. So he listened to them when he appointed people to various cabinet positions. He appointed a man named Albert Fall to be Secretary of the Interior. And Albert Fall tried to sell a mountain in Wyoming to an oil company that was supposed to be set aside for conservation. This was called the Teapot Dome scandal. Albert Fall went to prison over the Teapot Dome scandal. He was hauled into Congress to testify in front of Congress by the sergeant at arms. The subpoena was enforced. It wasn't that he was just allowed to challenge it in court a few times, and when he lost and still didn't show up, everybody was a little embarrassed. But no, it was enforced. They sent the cops after him and made him come testify. Several members of the Harding administration had to testify. The Attorney General, Harry Dougherty, resigned. An assistant attorney general narrowly escaped going to prison. Albert Fall did go to prison. And they couldn't stop there from being some consequences. Nixon had to resign. Nixon's people didn't evade subpoenas. They had to testify before Congress.
But Nixon never went to jail.
But Nixon never went to jail. Ford pardoned Nixon. And a lot of stuff has happened since then. But that moment where Ford pardoned Nixon was a moment where all these people who had taken the bullet for Nixon now see Ford pardoning Nixon and Nixon completely escaping unscathed, even after they told everything. And all of a sudden you get this whole, well, why did I take the consequences?
Right.
Attitude. And so nobody's going to take the consequences the same way again. Instead, you've got a system that's all about evading those consequences.
Right.
And there was always a belief that, the people who did the worst things would be made examples of. And that making examples of these people would keep other people in line. And it's happened at certain points in our history. There are points in our history where you can say, these people were made examples of in a way that discouraged other people in the system from doing something as bad for X, Y, or Z amount of years. And at some point that stopped. And it starts with Ford pardoning Nixon. Then Poppy Bush pardons a bunch of people for Iran-Contra. Then a few days before he leaves office, Bill Clinton pardons all sorts of people, like maybe he auctioned them off. And some people still swear he did to this day. I have no theory one way or the other. I don't know what to think.
But still, even when you think about the inequity of that, you have Black men who have died by death penalty for lesser crimes, right? You have
Some at Bill Clinton's hands, not literally, but as governor of Arkansas, he was the one who could have saved them, and he didn't.
Right. And you have poor people who are still sitting in jail because they can't afford bail money. Like the system is only.
No, I will say at this moment, the young lady who escaped from custody, who was in prison because she had shot her trafficker, they still haven't caught her again yet. So that's good news.
Well, that's good. Good.
Hopefully she's as Dr. Dooley from the Bernie campaign put it earlier today. I hope she's living her best life in Canada now.
Right. And but I just like there's a young man, and I hope I don't have his name wrong. Yes. I think it's Kevin Johnson.
Yes, that's the one.
Who, I mean,
they're getting ready to kill him in Ohio as we speak.
2 weeks out from the death penalty.
Yep.
And only because he did it after the laws were changed to make sure that anyone who killed a cop went up for the death penalty. There's no consideration of the trauma that he went through with that situation when they walked over his.
That's Ohio, right?
Actually, I think it's Missouri.
Missouri? Does Missouri have a stand your ground law?
I don't know.
Because you would think in any state with a stand your ground law, a black man, a cop, obviously it was self-defense. He felt threatened. Right?
You would think. I mean, the story is such a tragic one, and I just.
It's all, well, I mean, it always is.
Yeah, there's so many, right?
Yes.
There's so many stories of people who narrowly miss being put to death, and then we find out that they shouldn't have been there to begin with.
Mumia is still in prison.
Right. I mean, they just went back to court with him, what was that, week before last?
Yep.
To try and get him a fair trial. How he's still sitting in jail is beyond my
progressive prosecutor Larry Krasner is determined to uphold the honor of the judicial system on this one, or at least he has been.
Right. And they only care about the honor of the system when, it's
this is the progressive prosecutor who was elected to do progressive things and, not wrongfully prosecute black people, at least in theory.
Right.
But he's willing to stand behind
everywhere, like in Baltimore with Keith. Oh, what's his name? There's he was shot multiple times by the police.
Yes.
And they just keep putting that man back to trial, like over. I think it's been 4 times now. It's just, it is never ending, the cycle of like inequity and just complete disregard for law when it deals with Black, brown, and poor people and indigenous people.
This is correct. The MOVE organization, the survivors of that police bombing, and this is directly connected to Mumia. Mumia was targeted for having reported favorably on MOVE as being targeted by racist neighbors and bigoted police.
Right.
He had joined MOVE.
And did UPenn ever return the bones? Or
they returned some of the bones. They returned some of the bones eventually.
But that's just another prime example. You have a community that is living in their, on their own property. They don't.
Let's not forget that in 2008, define historical irony. The person who was ready at one point to use his power as a superdelegate from Pennsylvania to block Barack Obama from becoming president and assure that it was Hillary Clinton was Ed Rendell, who said, "Yeah, drop the bomb, chief."
Right.
All these things are connected. Mumia, MOVE, Ed Rendell, all this stuff. This was that same period when liberal Republicans and Black Republicans were losing elections to conservative white Democrats. The first Black senator since Reconstruction was a liberal Republican in Massachusetts named Edward Brooke, who was defeated by a conservative Democrat named Paul Tsongas. And people say, what happened to the liberal Republicans? Well, they lost elections to conservative Democrats, and only conservative Republicans, more conservative than conservative Democrats, survived.
It's an awful cycle.
But in that case, it literally started with conservative Democrats targeting liberal Republicans for defeat from the right.
Right.
Because issues on crime, because they hurt poor people more than rich people, would ultimately be another way to hide racism.
Right.
Which is why it was moved. It was bombed by a police department and not, actual gangsters in Philly, which Philly is kind of famous for.
Right. And that they destroyed an entire block. Like, they destroyed an entire neighborhood. Like,
whoever blew up a whole neighborhood in Little Italy in New York to try to take out the mafia. Right. I mean, by comparison.
Right. It's just, the whole thing's just, I don't know. But I just noticed the time, and I can hear
Yes, I need to let you go.
I do need to go.
I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much, Renee.
No problem, Chris. It is always my pleasure to come and hang out with you and learn something and to talk. And I always appreciate you letting me join in.
No, I always appreciate you hanging out with me, because I enjoy our conversations, and I'm just glad that we're like-minded enough to talk about some things that you can't always talk about.
Yeah.
And that's, especially these days, we have to be able to talk about this stuff.
Yep, absolutely.
And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Chris. I'll see you in the Twitter space.
Yeah. We'll tweet at you, folks. You all have a good night.
Have a good night.
And it was really a pleasure, folks. We're gonna try to have a great night. Bye.